finally have some real solid evidence that the Big Bang happened. Last year, you may have heard the talk by Spike Becerris where he said the Big Bang just didn't happen. Well, here, the secular scientists say we finally have the proof. Space ripples reveal Big Bang smoking gun. Major discovery, smoking gun for universe, incredible Big Bang expansion found. Observations confirm inflation of the early universe to cosmological sizes in the early instance. That's about the origin of the universe. That's what they're telling us today. How about the origin of life? Have the secular scientists finally been able to explain that how life started? Well, here's some announcements that came out just this year. You know, they really haven't figured it out, but they keep on making an attempt to try to explain how first life started. And here's just a few explanations. When they said in Science Daily on March 25th of this year, how the first organisms on Earth could have become metabolically active, speculate how primitive cells learned to synthesize their organic components, the molecules that form RNA, lipids, and amino acids. They suggest an order for the sequence that led to the origin of life. Notice the word they use, they suggest. They can't confirm, they suggest. Well, and then if we can't find life on Earth, perhaps it came from Mars. And that's the other quote here. So that's what they're telling us today. Now, how about complex life? This is really neo-Darwinian evolution. You know, once we got the first life, then Darwin supposedly explains how we get all the other life coming from that. And you've heard it. You know, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Evolution is a fact. Natural selection accounts for the apparent design in life. You know, they finally figured out the human genome. They said most of that genome, the DNA in that genome, that's just junk DNA. It's just left over from evolution. So this is what you're being told by your biology teachers. Okay, so is this the truth? I want to introduce a new book that just came out, written by Dan Greenup. It's called Generation Y. And he asks the question and answers the question, why am I here? And I was particularly impressed by the very first chapter, second chapter actually, in his book. He comes up with this quote. He says, "I hate to break it to you, but you've been lied to." Shocking, right? From elementary school on, we were all told that the universe created itself by chance, non-living chemicals formed into a living organism with complex genetic information, and that through natural selection, this organism grew more complex over millions of years. What's wrong with this account of history? Well, just one thing. There's none of these unproven assumptions are supported by scientific observation. There is no science behind it, is what he's basically saying. And he covers all three areas that I'm going to cover today. And that is origin of the universe. What does science say about that? What does science say about the origin of first life and the origin of complex life? So to do that, I'm going to start out with, well, how do we define science? What is science? And then what does science have to say about origins? I'll talk about some of the pseudoscience of the past, just to set this in context. And then I'll look at each of those three areas and look at the pseudoscience that we're being told about today and explain why that is pseudoscience. And then a summary verdict of that. And I'm using these two books, which are shown here. You know, The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking and The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins. Because they cover the origin of the universe, they cover supposedly first life and complex life. And those, I'm going to refute a lot of what they say in those two books. So let's start with the definition of science. How do we define science? In particular, we need to note that there's a distinction between observational science, which is, you know, the science that you all learned in school, and origin science, because it's not the same thing. Observational science, we can run experiments over and over and repeat it. In origin science, you can't do that. You can't go back to the beginning and run an experiment again. There's a basic difference. And the science of today, the science that you're being taught in school, is based on naturalism and materialism. And I'm going to give you just a brief explanation of that. And then, so what is pseudoscience? How do you know it's pseudoscience? And I'll give you some ways to detect pseudoscience. And then talk about 3 impossible hurdles that secular science has to overcome, but I'll show you there's no way it can overcome that. First, definitions. You may have known, well, you're not taught in that school today, but science was defined hundreds of years ago as knowledge discovered by experimentation, observation, and objective investigation. That's known as the scientific method. That's how we know science today. That's how we gain knowledge that can be gained by science. And then the UK Science Council, for example, this is one definition that's being used today. They're saying science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. In other words, it's become a pursuit as opposed to a body of knowledge established and discovered. And then we should note that talks about operational science. You know,
you're familiar with this here diagram here, how observational science is done.
Well, origin science is different because it's not testable. You can't go back in history and test it. All you can do is look to see what evidence God has left behind for us to look at. And therefore, facts are not verifiable or falsifiable, which is required by the scientific method. So you have to distinguish those 2 kinds of science. First of all, naturalism. What is it? Well, it's a belief denying that an event or object has a supernatural significance. Specifically, the doctrine that scientific laws are adequate to account for all phenomena. And here's a quote from a secular scientist. He says, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. So they just excluded it. Materialism, same kind of thing. It's a belief claiming that physical matter is the only or fundamental reality and that all organisms, processes, and phenomena can be explained as manifestations or interactions of matter. And again, here is a quote that you hear often. Lewontin is a biologist, a secularist, an atheist, evolutionist. He says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of the constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. So again, they exclude anything that is not materialism. They exclude anything that is not naturalism. But from a biblical point of view, we know that science is possible, and the Bible supports that. We know that objective truth is real. There is objective truth, despite what some of the seculars say. We know that the universe is real. The universe is orderly. In fact, some of these scientists on the side that you certainly know the names of, they said, we are studying what God created after him. We understood that God created this world, created life, and he gave us the ability, we have a rational mind, we can study what he created. And the Bible clearly tells us that man is both material and immaterial. In other words, we are created of material, but we have a mind that is immaterial. And therefore, man can reason, and we can use our reason even in the study of science. So then, what is pseudoscience in comparison? Well, here's the dictionary definition. Beliefs, practices mistakenly regarded as being based on scientific method. The scientific status of a theory depends on, it has to be falsifiable. it has to be testable in the first place. You have to be able to test. And you can do that with observational science, but you can't do that with origin science. So that's what's required to have a theory that can be tested. If it's not testable, that's not true science. And we'll get to the definition of evolution, but evolution falls into a philosophy. It's not testable science, as we'll see in a bit here. And the problem is what the seculars do is they look at examples of adaptability of living organisms to their environment, which is really microevolution, and they say, okay, look, that's happening. And yes, as scientists, we all agree it is happening. That doesn't mean that evolution is happening, okay? And I'll show you why. So how do you detect pseudoscience? Well, if you listen to what Dawkins has to say and Hawkins have to say, you'll see, first of all, that their theories are not testable. You can't test them for what they say. They use misleading language, or they use bait and switch arguments. They emphasize confirmation rather than refuting. If a theory is true, it has to be also refutable and verifiable and falsifiable. Otherwise, it's not a good theory. Some examples of that, I've spoken and studied the issue of anthropic global warming, and it falls in the same classification as evolution. You see the same arguments being used in both of those so-called scientists. And macroevolution, of course, is what we're going to talk about more here later. So that gets me to the meat of this. I'm going to label these three things: origin of the universe, origin of first life, origin of complex life forms, which is really macroevolution. All three of these are insurmountable, impossible hurdles for secular scientists to get over. You just can't get over those three. And I'll explain why further on here. So just back to origins a bit. There are three explanations for how we got here, why we're here. And the first one, of course, is from the Bible, creation. God created in the beginning. God created, Genesis 1:1. And so he created the universe. He created life. He created life according to kinds. If you read chapter 1 of Genesis, he mentions the word kind 10 times. Think he means it? I think so. And then we'll look at some of the evidence of what does it say about that. Evolution. Well, we just got here through evolution. There's no supernatural being involved, no designer involved. And by evolution, as you see, we mean macroevolution. Molecules to man, goo to you, through the zoo has been used also to explain that. But there are many different definitions of that. But basically, molecules, dead molecules, somehow started first life, and then here we are. And third explanation, intelligent design. And that means that there is a designer. If we see design, we know there's a designer involved. I mean, even look at a common chair out there. You'll know that chair isn't there because stuff fell from the ceiling and it just formed into a chair. Somebody designed the chair. Somebody built the chair. That's a simple chair. What about the human cell? What about the universe? The galaxies of the universe. They didn't just get there by accident. So what do we mean by evolution? And this is where we really need to pay attention, because people tend to use these definitions interchangeably. And we'll all agree that the first three definitions, yes, we see those things happening. We see artificial selection, what it could do in the 1800s, 1900s. Scientists used artificial selection to get cows that give you the most milk, or the plants that grow the best. Yes, you can do some artificial selection, but there's a limit to what you can do there. Change, some people will say, it's changing, therefore it's evolving. They use those two words interchangeably. Third, microevolution. minor adaptations to the environment that we live in. Yes, that happens. But in all three of those we see.
The fourth one, however,
For macroevolution, that is that molecule to man, Darwinian evolution. Do we see any evidence for that? No, I would submit, no evidence according to the scientific method. And then the fifth one, which we call molecular evolution, that is the origin of life. Is that even possible? Has that ever been observed? No, it's totally impossible, as you'll see. So when I use the word evolution in this talk, I mean macroevolution, which has never been observed, but that's what we're talking about. And just a few words on mechanism. Natural selection. Darwin said, evolution is possible because of natural selection. Well, what can natural selection do? It's been shown to only decrease information in the living organism that comes in the next generation. It allows organisms to survive better in a given environment. That's true. It acts as a selector. That's true. And it supports the creation orchard of life.
you can see this orchard on the bottom left here, where the creation, morphology, everything was created according to its kind in chapter 1 of Genesis. Now, evolution, Darwinian evolution, you have this tree. Everything started from the first living cell and then eventually branched out, and you get all the living organisms at the top here. Well,
natural selection, it can't increase the information in a living genome. There's no way to do that. Or to allow organisms to evolve from molecules to man, therefore. It can't act as an originator of new information that you need to build more complex living organism. And it can't support the evolutionary tree of life. Okay, so then, before I get into what the scientists are saying today, I want to just review history a little bit, look at the pseudoscience of the past. And I call these, they would say that we are using God of the gaps. I would say evolutionists are using evolution of the gaps. They're trying to explain the gaps that we all see in nature and said those gaps, they've been crossed by evolution. We can't show you the evidence, but just trust us. They've been crossed. And I would say those gaps are getting wider and wider, are impossible to cross. So I'm going to talk about these 5 or 6 here. Fossil record. Even Darwin, in his book, Origin of Species, said this: why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So he realized that he didn't have the fossil record supporting his theory back in 1859 when he wrote this book. Some creation scientists, Duane Gish in particular, studied this issue in the 1980s and wrote a book. He said, evolution, the fossils say no. 10 years later, he wrote another book, Evolution, the fossils still say no. 2000, Jonathan Wells, who's an intelligent design person, he looked at some of the icons of evolution that we all know very well.
You recognize this icon, of course. Going from ape-like creature, bending over, and then vertical man here. Well, he looked at these 10 or 11 things that are used to, quote, prove that evolution is true, and said none of them are true. And he wrote a whole book on that back in 2000. So that's last decade. So that's for the fossil record. How about human origins? You may have recognized some of these names. Neanderthal man, for example. It was said to be an intermediate between some ape-like creature and a modern man. Well, it turns out it's just modern man. It had some deficiencies, some bone deficiencies, but nevertheless, it's part of the human
or was part of the human race. Java man was an artificial construct. Piltdown man, 50 years after being found, or I should say constructed as a hoax, it was determined that it really was a hoax. And people have now disregard that. That's not real. Nebraska man, based on the finding a tooth of an extinct pig, that's no longer believable. And orangutan, again, no longer believable. It really, or the Rambapithecus really is a orangutan and not some intermediate. And the latest one that they put a lot of effort on was Lucy. Well, Lucy turns out to be a make-believe creature because it was created from bones found at 2 different locations.
They only have 40% of the skeleton, and if you look at the
Museum in Chicago, for example,
they show this as a hairy
creature. How do they know how much hair that creature had? They don't. It's all an artist's conception of what it was, and it's not real. I mean, there's books and DVDs on that now. But there's no new ones listed, like you might have heard of Ida and some others, that fossils that have been found. None of them are anywhere close to these samples. But they're hesitant to take Lucy out of the textbook because they don't have a better example yet. Okay, so that's for human fossils. Haeckel's embryos. This was shown in the 1800s, shortly after Darwin came out with his book. Haeckel, a German embryologist, showed this picture, drew this picture. He said, look at all of these, you can't see the names on there, but these are, things like pigs and birds and humans and other mammals shown there. They said they all went through the same stages of evolution. You can see evolution in motion because they all went through the same stages. Well, it turns out, he said
this first line was supposed to be early embryos. Well, it turns out these are different stages in the life of these different mammals.
And they're not at the beginning. They're at some other place. And so eventually this was determined to be a complete hoax. It's fake drawings. That's not real. So this is also now known not to be good evidence for evolution. Vestigial organs. It was said in the 1800s, 1900s, that many of the organs that we have are really leftovers from evolution. And your appendix or your tonsils, all these things that were said to be organs that lost their function. They're no longer needed. And even the dictionary of the day said, defined the vestigial as lost its function in the course of evolution. Why is that phrase, in the course of evolution, there? They assume that evolution is true. So at the late, in 1893, this German scientist came up with a list of 86 human organs which were said to be vestiges, left over from evolution. We now know, and in fact there's a book written by Jerry Bergman,
shown here, vestigial organs are all fully functional. And I'll show you some examples.
The appendix, it's part of our immune system. Yes, you can live without it, but you're better off with your appendix still there and your tonsils still there because they're part of your immune system. They're not leftovers from evolution. And, there's 86 of those that have now been shown, not to be vestigial. And then finally, here's one from, remember the Scopes trial of 1925. What did they use as evidence that evolution is true? Well, they used these
6 things that I've listed here. Neanderthal man, Piltdown, Nebraska. Haeckel's forged embryo drawings, peppered moth, vestigial organs, those things. All of those
are now known not to support evolution. And yet, you find some of that still in the textbook. Your students are still being taught that in their biology class. And so I call this pseudoscience. Science that was so called back in the early 1900s is now shown to be pseudoscience. And evolutionists should not be using that as proof of evolution. Well, let's get to modern new atheist. And by new atheists, I particularly refer to people like Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, both from England, who say, we call them new atheists because they're more rabid atheists. They're almost evangelical atheists. They want all of us to believe that atheism is the right belief system. So some of the books I've used are listed here to come to the conclusions I've come to. And there's one in between here.
She's not one of these new atheists, but she is a journalist who has written a book called the Altenberg 16, which is an expose
of the evolution industry. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. But these other four authors are ones that I've used to come up with some of the arguments that I'm going to go through here. So let's go through the first of these three we're going to look at. I'm going to look at the origin of the universe, I'm going to look at the origin of first life, and I'm going to look at the origin of complex life. So first of all, in the origin of the universe, secular scientists would say, we got here through the Big Bang. That's how it all started. First there was nothing, and then it exploded. How believable is that? And then I showed at the very beginning this quote from March 17th that the Big Bang has finally been proven because we see remnants of the cosmic inflation. What's inflation? Well, let me just show you a picture here.
Here's a model of
The Big Bang. And I'm not going to go through
all of it here, but just to say that
at the beginning, there was nothing, and then all of a sudden that nothing exploded.
And then came to be our universe here. Here's the time frame here, 13.7 billion years. And here's the size of our universe today, supposedly. And you can see it expanded here. It's gotten bigger vertically. But at the beginning, there's something called inflation. And that inflation
supposedly happened at the very beginning in less than a second of time, the very first second. And why is that there? We've never observed it. We haven't seen it. Well, the Big Bang theory doesn't work unless you have inflation, unless it grows much bigger all of a sudden at the beginning. That's the only way we can explain the Big Bang, sort of. And so scientists said, well, now we have evidence that the Big Bang really did happen, that inflation really did happen. How do we know that? First of all, evidence for the Big Bang. What do scientists or secular scientists use for that? Well, here's three common ones. Redshift of starlight, cosmic microwave background radiation, and element abundances. But there's plenty of evidence against the Big Bang. Quantized red shifts, for example. It's not just red shifts. The shifts are actually quantized, a million years apart in secular time frame. And creation scientists have used these three things I've listed here against the Big Bang. There is another explanation for the universe than the Big Bang. And I'm going to walk through some of that here. First of all, you have to realize we don't understand much about cosmology, how the universe started. Of all the areas of science, this is the least understood. And as you'll see, even secular scientists like Dr. Richard Liu, astrophysicist, he says this: cosmology is not even astrophysics. All the principal assumptions in this field are unverified. You can't verify the assumptions, is what he's saying. So you can't put them in a lab and run the experiments again, because the universe offers no controlled experiment, that is, with no independent checks. It is bound to be highly ambiguous and degenerate. That's from a secular scientist's point of view. But cosmologists have become comfortable with inventing unknowns to explain an unknown, because there's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the beginning, and yet they use more unknowns to try and explain the unknowns. And here's 5 of them that they use. First of all, their theory requires that certain things are there in the universe that we can't see. Dark matter is one of those. You know, if you look at the galaxy, the science of a galaxy, and you know, there's a way to estimate the mass of that based on the momentum of moving parts. They say it can't account, the mass that we see can't account for the Big Bang. So what do? They come up with the definition or the existence of dark matter. It's called dark matter because you can't see it. It doesn't allow light to go through it. So we have no way of measuring it. It's just an assumption that they have. It's an unknown, and they use an unknown to explain the other unknown, which is inflation. Inflation was invented. It wasn't discovered. It was invented to explain some of these unknowns. And so the result is, 4% of what is out in the universe, supposedly, is something that can be seen and measured. That is this 4% atoms, what you know as physical matter. There's dark energy, which we can't measure. There's dark matter, which we can't see or measure. So only 4% of this is what we can see. So there's a lot of unknowns there. So a little bit more about the Big Bang. First of all, they say, well, there must have been some singularity where everything is just in one small dot, if you will, which you can't see, you can't measure, and then all of a sudden that exploded. Well, what caused that to explode? Well, over time, Hawkins and other theoretical scientists have explained it by a number of different things. Quantum fluctuations. What's a quantum fluctuation? Well, some of you may have heard of quantum mechanics, which explains waves of quanta. And he would say, well, there was just happened to be the right fluctuation of these quanta in this singularity to cause the universe that we see come to be. How do you measure that? You can't. It's just an assumption. The other thing that the inflation model does is it covers a lot of problems with the Big Bang. For example, the horizon problem. If you look at the distance in the secular model, from the center out to the sides, 13.7 billion light years one way, 13.7 light years the other way. You got 28 light years between them. Why is the density, the temperature the same all over that we measure? Why is it the same? It shouldn't be, because you can't get from the one end of the universe to the other end. And so the inflation model was supposed to explain that. So the cosmic inflation, if cosmic inflation happened, they say there should be such a thing as gravitational waves that we can measure. And so on March 13th, or March 17th of this year, that's what that announcement was all about. Okay, so they say it seems that evidence for inflation may have been found. We may have found some evidence for inflation. It doesn't say that we did. It just said it may have been found. So, and this is what they showed. I showed that in the first picture. This here, can't see that very well there, but it's a wave phenomena which they measured in their instruments with polarization in there, and said that proves that inflation happened. Well, there are many unknowns in the Big Bang theory, and cosmic inflation is not a single theory. There's many different theories of cosmic inflation, so they haven't even narrowed that down. And that if the model changes, the results of what you measure are going to change. And inflation is just one of the parameters of the unknowns in the Big Bang theory. And then in just this month, May 12th, even secular scientists came out and said, we don't know if this is real. because the scientists who took these measurements haven't subtracted out some of the foreground radiation that they see in the universe. They have to subtract that out properly to verify that this is really due to inflation, and they haven't done that yet. And from a creation science point of view, there are many different explanations for why we could see these gravitational waves. It doesn't have to be, what they said here. It doesn't have to be due to the Big Bang. In fact, the creation model for the beginning of the universe is somewhat different, well, quite a bit different from the Big Bang. And it doesn't require the use of dark energy or dark matter and a whole bunch of other things. And it's closer to reality than what the Big Bang is. But we won't go into that here. Okay, then just a few other things. Lawrence Krauss, another theoretical physicist, says the universe that we live in started from nothing. It came from nothing. Now, think about that for a minute. If it came from nothing, what was there before nothing? Yeah, and where did that come from? Who created that? They can't answer. But he's saying the universe is zero energy, and quantum fluctuations could explain why we have a universe. Stephen Hawking adds, well, if there's such a thing as the law of gravity, the universe will come about because of the law of gravity. Well, where did the law of gravity come from? Who created that? I mean, he assumes that the law of gravity was in existence. Well, what did it have to pull together? Nothing. So these assumptions are false in the first place. And so they're all about rejecting a supernatural explanation for this. They're just trying to come up with a natural explanation, and they just can't. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And this is a quote from a secular scientist. You can't read that there, but it said, what is a big deal? The biggest of all is how you get something out of nothing. That's from a secular scientist. They don't understand it either. And so I'm not going to read the rest of it, but I think you get the gist for what it says. There are even secular scientists who know the Big Bang is not real. It's just an explanation that they have to come up with using naturalism because they don't want to consider the supernatural. The other argument that we use as creationists is we say that the universe we live in is fine-tuned to be able to support life. And there are hundreds of physical constants which are exactly what they need to be to support life. One is the law of gravity, the 1 over r squared, that the attraction is proportional to the 1 over the square of the distance between those two bodies. If that had been 1.99 or 2.01, this universe wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here to talk about it. The tilt of the Earth, the distance from the sun, all these things, the mass of the proton, the mass of the neutron, all these things are exactly what they need to be in order to support life. And there are hundreds of those constants which are exactly what they need to be. How do secular scientists explain that? Well, they don't want to believe that there was a designer behind that designed the universe so it could support life. So what do they say? There are more than one universe. We have, in fact, they would say 10 to the power of 500 universe in existence. But how would we know that? We can only measure what we have in our own universe. We can't see, and if there's another universe, we can't see it, we can't measure it. So it's a conjecture on their part. That's how they get around the argument of this universe was designed specifically to support life. That's the only explanation they have. So, and we live in the universe, we're just lucky. It just happened to have all the right things. Because if enough universes, and they're all different, by chance, you might live in a universe that life is possible. And we are so lucky that we live in this universe. That's what secular scientists would say. But there's no way to verify that. None. And so it's just pure speculation on their part. String theory is used to explain some of this. I'm not going to get into this due to time, but you know, they say we live in a multi-dimensional world, up to 10, 11 dimensions. Actually, we just live in a world of 4 dimensions. You know, the height, the width, and the length, and time. That's what we live in. That's all we can measure. And then finally, I have 2 quotes here, one from a creation cosmologist and another one from a secular astrophysicist. Let me just read them briefly. John Hartnett, who is well known in the creation ministries here, says, I describe the history of the development of the standard Big Bang cosmology and how it is understood in terms of its philosophical underpinnings. The cosmological principle is explained as the major and essential assumption upon which it all depends. Due to this, it has been required to invent unknown stuff, the expansion of space, dark energy, dark matter, the cosmic background radiation of the Big Bang, and inflation. All of those are assumptions. None of them can be measured in the lab. So it's all philosophical conjecture. That's what he's saying. Even the secular scientists would say the barrier to knowledge, some argues, is cosmology's Achilles heel. Cosmology may look like a science, but it isn't a science. It's not. Even cosmologists will say this is not science, this is philosophy. So with that conclusion for the origin of the universe, Big Bang fudge factors explained by inflation, did they explain them? No. They just created more problems, more unknowns. These are some of the ones that we listed here. Cosmic inflation is unobserved. You can't see it. In fact, if inflation occurred, by their model, would occur in the first 100,000 years, and at that time, light, according to the theory, was not visible. It's microwave, that part of the spectrum. The universe from nothing, no, we showed that's just not logical, that's just conjecture. Fine-tuning is real. You know, we live in the universe created by God. It's fine-tuned for life. And whatever these secular scientists say is just trying to talk around it. It's pure speculation. So cosmology depends on unverifiable assumptions. So now let's quickly look at the second part of this, origin of first life. How do they try to explain that? I'm going to look at some news that has come out lately and look at the ingredients for life, and then talk about some of the methods that the secular scientists would say, this is how we got here. Okay, let me jump into it. New Scientist, back in April of this year, just recently said, a spark of life. Metabolism appeared in lab without cells. It occurred spontaneously. So we scientists have figured out how to show metabolism in the lab without involving a real cell. Another explanation, Mars could have supported life. You know, they've looked at the surface of Mars and said, well, give it 10 years and you know, we've seen some supposedly livable, evidence of livable mud. And therefore, life could have started in Mars. It's conceivable. But they have no evidence for that. Number 4, their power behind a primordial soup discovered. They said, well, we finally discovered that the primordial soup could have existed back in the early days. And they found the element phosphorus on Mars. Phosphorus is required for life. Said, we found phosphorus, therefore, again, life could have started on Mars. No evidence, but it could have. And so on. I'm not going to go through here, except the third one here in the DNA blog, October of 2013. Craig Vintner,
a very active and well-known biologist
in studying the possible beginning of life. A news story came out and says, how Craig Venter created life. You know, that's the headlines. So you say, oh, finally he figured out how new life could have been started through science. Well, what he did was he created some synthetic DNA, but he put that into a living cell. He started out with a genome that had life in it, and then added this DNA into it. That's all he did. He created synthetic life, not starting from scratch, despite what some of the news stories say. So why is this such a big problem? Well, to have life, if you look at the human cell, you have to have these 5 things at least. Amino acids, which make up proteins. There are thousands of different amino acids, and they're left-handed amino acids and they're right-handed amino acids. The only 20 that are part of living proteins are 20 specific left-handed amino acids, not right-handed, only left-handed. So there's 20 out of the 40 or 4,000 or so, and they're all left-handed. You must have DNA, and you must also have RNA in the cell. You must have sugar backbones in the cell, and you must have what they call lipids, or a cell membrane. In other words, the cell is surrounded by a membrane, keeping bad stuff out and letting bad stuff go out from the cell. Those 5 things have to exist. And so how do they happen? So you have a chicken and egg problem. Which came first? How do you start life? If DNA requires RNA to get started, well, where did RNA come from? And so they're all interdependent. You can't have one without the other. So is life possible from non-life? That's the theory of abiogenesis. In other words, can life start from non-living material? If you had some organic molecules in a primordial soup, could they combine and start life just on their own? The Miller-Urey experiment was an effort at that. It didn't get the right results, despite what they tell you in the textbooks. It got right-handed and left-handed amino acids. Didn't get the right ones. So then the question is, well, if there's no way to start life on Earth, could it have started perhaps in the deep ocean? And that's one theory. Another, could it come from another planet, like Mars? No. There are some very important showstoppers here. First of all, every cell needs information in there, and that information is then DNA. If you don't have DNA, you don't have information. The complexity of the cell, the redundancy, the mathematical probability of forming just one cell is mathematically impossible. It can be shown. So even Richard Dawkins would say there is enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. He acknowledges that there's a lot of information in one cell, but he just can't acknowledge that there was a designer behind that. He still thinks that all came through random chance. No way. How did life begin? Could it have started in a tidal pool or primordial soup? Could it have started in the ocean, in hydrothermal vents? Because if you look at some hydrothermal vents in the ocean today, there is some living material out there. So could it have started there? What about same thing with a volcanic pool in the ocean? Could it, and if it can't start from Earth, could it have started outside? Either from Mars or from another planet or even from another galaxy, on a meteorite and a comet, asteroid. And, it can be shown, no, there's no way to do that because life, any living organism couldn't survive in the universe coming to Earth. It's just impossible. So if it comes back to Earth, then what do you need? Well, you need these possible steps. Chemicals that exist in the early Earth would have to get together and form molecules, and then form organic molecules, and then somehow organize into proteins, amino acids and proteins, and then finally cells. Can that happen by chance? Can that happen can they assemble themselves? Can they self-organize? And no, there's no way to do that. And yet all of those steps are required to form life on Earth. Here's a scientist, professor of biology. He says, over the last 50 years, no empirical evidence supports the hypothesis of spontaneous appearance of life on Earth from nothing but a molecular soup. And no significant advance in scientific knowledge leads in this direction. Here's a secular biologist saying this. We don't have the evidence, but yet there are many people working on trying to find that evidence. And one of the things that it required was this self-replicating molecule. And there's a creation scientist who has said, quote from him, he says, "It is now accepted with so many qualifications that its scientific integrity, even as a heuristic device, is questionable." In other words, there's just no way that self-replicating molecule could be created through evolution. It just can't happen. Darwin came out in 1871. In his book, Origin of Species, he didn't really address the issue of how first life might have gotten started. But in 1871, he came out and said this: "It is often said that all the conditions for the first production of a living organism are now present, which could ever have been present." Notice all the pieces that are required, well, they're all present. He said, but if, and oh, what a big if we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia, phosphorus, etc., that are required in a protein, was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes as required by evolution. At the present day, such matter would be instantly absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were found. In other words, in today's world, we couldn't run an experiment to show this. It's impossible. The conditions are, just wrong. And he said, well, before, in the early days, there must have been the environment that could allow this to happen. So it's all conjecture on his part. He's saying there must have been some warm pond. So some scientists tried to test his idea. Looked at volcanoes, volcanic pools in the ocean. Is that the right environment? Nope, that was the wrong environment. Let me step to the next one here. Hydrothermal vents. Could it have happened in the hydrothermal events in the ocean? And again, the environment has been shown to be inhospitable to that to have happened. Yes, there's life today on these hydrothermal vents in the ocean, but the environment was very different, and that doesn't mean that life could have been started there. That's all pure conjecture. Some of the problems with that, ultraviolet rays would kill amino acids regardless. Organic molecules turn to be unstable above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and these vents in the ocean are hundreds of degrees, the heat there. So it couldn't have started in that environment. Where does the organic building blocks come from? Can't be explained. Proteins, DNA, RNA, lipids, and all that are required of a living cell. Again, there's no environment to produce those. Nothing could have produced them there. So, and proteins in the ocean, they don't concentrate. They have to be very concentrated to form a cell in life, and they just don't do that. So again, the idea of such a soup containing all desired organic molecules in concentrated form has been a misleading concept against which objections were raised very early. So despite that the objections were raised earlier, 100 years back, scientists are still trying to prove that life could have started in these ocean vents. Well, if it can't happen here, certainly it must have been possible to happen on another planet or another galaxy or another universe, what have you. That's what panspermia means. And so if there was a living cell on some other planet, how could it have gotten here? Could it have come through a comet or an asteroid? And again, that implies that the right ingredients were there for life on these other planets. And so far, we found no planets that could possibly have supported that kind of environment. Space rocks could have brought water and organic molecules to Earth. So there are basically two requirements. First of all, there must have been a source for life in some other planet, extraterrestrial life. And then that life had to be transferred to Earth somehow. Either that could have been through, comets, asteroids, or what if there's some intelligence out in some other galaxy in the universe, and they sent that life here, the seeds of life to Earth, and that's how life started on Earth. That's the only other explanation. So, life could not have come from Mars. There's just too many things that could go wrong, and nobody has shown that is anywhere close to being true. And then the last explanation, directed spermia, which some prominent scientists like Francis Crick even believe could have happened. And yet we know that's very, very improbable, and that's just conjecture. Okay, let me go to the conclusion of this part here. Life by undirected natural causes, there's just no way. It just can't happen. Here is a secular scientist who agrees that it just can't happen. The probabilities are way, way too low, and the components needed to support life are just not there. So in conclusion, we looked at the primordial soup, the pond, the vent, the volcano, other sources, either on Earth, from the ocean, or from Mars or other planets. It just can't happen. And the mathematical probability of that happening from non-life to life is just zero. The numbers are just too small. Self-assembly, which is what the theorists are working on now, there's no evidence that that even happened. And moreover, it's not science because it's not testable. Well, the third section here, I'm going to have to cut short, but this is the origin of complex life forms. Let's assume that somehow the universe got going. Let's assume that first life got going. How do we explain, how do scientists explain that we could have gotten more complex life? And that's really neo-Darwinian evolution. And the last two there, 6 and 7, the myth of junk DNA, you may have heard that argument before. It said most of the DNA, when they first looked at the human genome, they said only 2% of that is used to form proteins, and all the rest is junk. It's just left over from evolution. Is that true? No. Human and genome and chimp DNA are very similar. So chimp is our closest relative. And so does science bear that out? And I'm going to skip to those quickly in view of time. But all the other arguments, they just don't hold water. So the myth of junk DNA. That was a term that was coined back in 1972. It said the vast majority of the genome doesn't code for proteins. It's just junk, just left over from evolution. Even as late as 2004, these 8 atheist evolutionists said, it's just junk. And yet the human genome had already been put together and understood that it wasn't junk anymore. There's a explanation for how that's used. And so it's claimed to be evidence against ID and creation. History of DNA, the important thing here, even in 2009, Dawkins was still saying that junk DNA is evidence for evolution. Well, in 2012, they did a complete study of the human genome, and here's what they found. They have an explanation for how the rest of the DNA is used, even the junk DNA, so-called junk DNA. Okay, and then the last one here, human and chimp DNA is said to be very similar. In fact, they use some of the same numbers. The first studies, before the human genome had been formed, they said the human genome and the chimp genome are about 98.8% the same. But it turns out they didn't include all the evidence at that point. Creation assumptions, you include all the other assumptions and all the other data that they ignored in the secular study, as shown here. But in summary, using all the other data, and including the chimp data that was finally gathered in 2005, they are shown to be only 81% in common. It's not 98% common, it's 81% common. And so the whole argument for the similarity of the genomes is out the window. It doesn't hold water. So in conclusion, junk DNA is a myth. It's not the result of evolution. Human and chimp DNA are very different. Going from 1.5% difference to, difference to 20% difference if you include all the differences. And so overall, what's the verdict of this? Well, the origin of the universe requires a designer. It's been created, been fine-tuned for life. The origin of first life requires a designer. Life is more than just matter. It's mass and energy plus information. And then complex life also requires a designer for the same reason. Material, which is mass and energy, and immaterial, which is information. So the evolution gaps that we looked at, those three, they're just so stories. That's not science, it's pseudoscience. Those explanations have failed in the past. We show that more and more of those explanations, those just so stories, are failing, and I'm confident that they will fail in the future as well. So in summary, new atheist science is largely pseudoscience. They don't explain those three huge gaps that they're trying to hurdle over. So with that, I bring it to a conclusion. Thank you for your attention.